The case of Susan Wright, the blue-eyed butcher of Texas. Anger is a powerful negative emotion, during which a person typically seeks to harm themselves or those around them. The English playwright John Dryden once said, "Beware the wrath of a patient man, for he will exact revenge when you have forgotten both the man and the very cause of the wrath." Long accumulating negative feelings, pain, and resentment will inevitably find an outlet, and a person who always forgave and gave one more chance to make things right can become the most ruthless judge and executioner. The case of Susan Wright in the early 2000s shocked everyone with its incredible cruelty, but the merciless perpetrator stood before the court and, it seemed, received deserved punishment. However, several years later it turned out that not everything in this story was so clear-cut, and a bloody conclusion was preceded by many years of patience, resignation, and silence. This family, at first glance, seemed ideal, but no one could imagine what was happening in their home behind closed doors. But let's try to understand from the beginning the case of the blue-eyed butcher to comprehend what pushed a fragile young woman, a mother of 2 children, to such a desperate and simply monstrous act. Who is Susan Wright? Susan Lucille Wright, née Witch, was born on April 24, 1976 in Houston, Texas, into the simple family of Velma Sue and Jimmy Lawrence Witch. She was the eldest of 2 children of her parents, raised alongside her biological sister named Cindy. From an early age, Susan was an active and sociable child with creative talents. During her school years, she was seriously involved in dancing and aspired to become a choreographer in the future. The girl had a bright, attractive appearance and a slender figure, always having numerous admirers, and she herself loved being the center of attention. After graduating from high school, despite her efforts, Wright couldn't get into college. However, she didn't lose heart, deciding to take a short break and save money for her education. For several months, she worked as a dancer at one of the popular nightclubs in the city. There, the young blonde performed topless, gaining some notoriety, which she was certainly not proud of. She decided to quit this job and never return to it, using her savings to pay for evening courses at a nursing school. Susan always aimed for independence, so alongside her studies, she took a job as a waitress in a restaurant to support herself. Soon, she realized that medicine was not her true calling, and she struggled financially to pay for her education. Therefore, the young blonde abandoned her courses, focusing on her work instead. The romance with Jeffrey Wright. In the summer of 1997, 21-year-old Susan met her future husband, Jeffrey Andrew Wright. Their first encounter was at the Galveston restaurant where she worked as a waitress, and he stopped by for a meal. He was instantly captivated by the beauty and radiant smile of the blue-eyed blonde, leaving generous tips and becoming a regular customer from then on. Jeffrey took a while to ask her out, but eventually mustered the courage to get her phone number. Susan later recalled that the man began calling her daily, sometimes several times a day, arranging romantic dates and small surprises, like sending flowers with touching notes to her work, and in the evenings, he would meet her and walk her home. The man was 8 years her senior, but this minor age difference didn't particularly bother them. He was attentive, very sweet and caring, quickly winning over Susan. However, it soon emerged that Jeffrey had some issues with alcohol and the use of controlled substances. He claimed to have left drugs in the past and promised to give up alcohol completely. The naive young woman believed him. She was truly in love for the first time and felt they could overcome any challenges together. Soon, Susan discovered she was pregnant and hurried to share this happy news with her beloved. Wright seemed pleased at the prospect of becoming a father, but made no decisive moves. He didn't propose, and they continued to live separately. Confused by her boyfriend's behavior, Susan took the initiative into her own hands. She insisted that their first child should be born in wedlock, and her partner simply accepted her conditions. By the time the couple officially legalized their relationship, Susan was already 8 months pregnant. They didn't have a grand celebration with a white dress and a tiered cake, opting for a quiet wedding without guests or witnesses. Around this time, they purchased their own home in the quiet Harris County, Texas, moving in just a couple of weeks before the birth of their child. The perfect family. In December 1998, the Wrights welcomed their first child together, a son named Bradley. In 2001, Susan became pregnant again, and in the spring of 2002, she gave birth to a daughter, Kaylee. The couple also got a small dog named Buck, had their own comfortable family car, and seemingly lived a life that resembled the embodiment of the American dream. Jeffrey worked at a local construction company, and after the birth of their children, Susan, by mutual agreement, became a homemaker. She took care of raising the kids and creating a cozy environment in their family nest. Neighbors, with whom Mrs. Wright maintained friendly relations, spoke of her as a kind, friendly, and sociable young woman, a caring mother, and a loving wife. The family indeed seemed perfect, but as it turned out, the reality was quite different. It was later revealed that her husband was extremely demanding in every aspect. Susan spent her days cleaning, doing laundry, and cooking. Jeffrey only ate fresh, home-cooked meals, and she couldn't prepare meals for 2 days at a time or reheat leftovers. The house had to be in perfect order and cleanliness, a mere impossibility with 2 small children. Jeffrey's clothes needed to be washed almost daily, as he wouldn't wear the same item twice. If any of these rules were broken, it led to insults, humiliation, and even physical abuse. Financially, Jeffrey turned out to be extremely stingy. The romantic, who once gifted flowers and presents, was gone, and he now only gave his wife $100 a week. This was meant to cover cooking, maintaining the house, and buying everything necessary for the children. Susan had to account for all expenses to her husband and provide receipts. Jeffrey did not quit drinking as he had promised earlier, but that was just the tip of the iceberg. He began using drugs again. He categorically denied his addiction, referring to his drug use as light doping to cope with work stress and stay in good shape. However, under the influence of these substances, he often became aggressive, capable of hitting his wife or even their young son. Whenever Susan pleaded with him to seek professional help and undergo rehabilitation to overcome his destructive habits, Jeffrey reacted with outbursts of anger. He saw no problem with his behavior, arguing that Susan married him knowing about his alcohol and drug use, and thus she should now accept and live with it. Remarkably, Jeffrey's parents were also aware of their son's weaknesses. They sympathized with their daughter-in-law but felt helpless to assist her. The last straw. According to the woman, her husband began displaying aggression towards her almost immediately after they started living together. This manifested in physical, emotional, and intimate abuse. Initially, he would apologize each time, promising it would never happen again, and she wanted to believe him. But soon, Jeffrey stopped apologizing, and the violence in the family became a commonplace occurrence. Jeffrey visited the gym 3 times a week to practice boxing. He said these workouts allowed him to blow off steam, adding that he would definitely take his son with him once the boy was a bit older. On Monday, January 13th, 2003, Wright went to the gym after work as usual. He returned home on edge, seeming excited and nervous. While his wife was preparing dinner, he decided to tell his son about boxing and demonstrate a few techniques. At one point, he got carried away, misjudged his strength, and hit the 5-year-old boy. The child burst into tears, and the father tried to soothe him, hoping his wife wouldn't hear. Susan indeed pretended not to notice, but this incident was the final straw for her. After dinner, she went to put the children to bed, while her husband remained in the bedroom, where he took another dose of controlled substances. What happened next varies in different accounts. The woman claimed that as soon as she entered the room, her husband attacked her, wrongfully took advantage of her, and attempted to end her life with a knife, but she managed to wrestle the weapon from his hands, and the ensuing confrontation was purely in self-defense. However, her story changed multiple times, and the investigation's version presented at the trial appeared more credible, becoming the official account. Seduced, immobilized, and brutally ended a life. Susan decided to use her dancing skills to seduce her husband and lower his guard. She entered the room in a short silk robe worn over her bare body, performing a tantalizing show for her husband. Then, she suggested a role-playing game involving tying up, to which he readily agreed. She used 3 of Jeff's neckties to bind his hands and right leg to the bed. His left leg was secured with the silk belt from her robe. Once he was immobilized, Susan improvised a gag using her own underwear. adding to the guise of an intimate game. To set the mood, she lit candles and turned off the lights. Jeffrey was bound hand and foot, securely fastened to the bed, with a gag in his mouth surrounded by dim lighting. Initially, Mrs. Wright took one of the candles and poured hot wax on the man's chest. Although painful, it still resembled a part of their game. Then the same fate befell his intimate area, and soon the pain became unbearable. Jeffrey did not immediately realize what was happening. He tried to free himself, tried to scream, but to no avail. Meanwhile, his wife repeatedly struck him with a small, sharp knife she had brought from the kitchen. She started with the groin area, moving up and down, slashing his genitals, legs, abdomen, chest, arms, neck, and face. At first, Susan acted slowly, voicing her grievances with each strike, recounting the insults, humiliations, and abuse she had endured. Then she began to cry and struck faster and faster. Forensic experts would later count 193 shallow knife wounds on the deceased's body. The majority of these wounds were not fatal, and the man was conscious for most of the ordeal. Her actions indicated she was in a state of despair and intense emotional turmoil, with her lawyers insisting on a state of affect. She couldn't stop even when her husband showed no signs of life, and she hadn't yet considered what she would do next, or how she would handle the body. Shallow grave in the backyard. For the next several hours, the woman simply sat on the floor next to the bed where her husband's body lay. She then looked around and realized the bedroom was covered in blood, and she needed to act before dawn. Susan cautiously peered out the window, ensuring no neighbors had their lights on, and that it was quiet and deserted outside. Her gaze fell upon a shallow pit that Jeffrey had dug over the weekend to install a fountain in the backyard. A plan formed instantly. This pit was to become the grave for her despised spouse. To move the body from the bedroom to the yard, Susan used a common garden wheelbarrow. This aspect raised many questions for the investigators, as a petite, slender woman managed to single-handedly load and transport a man much taller and twice her weight out of the house. There were suspicions of an accomplice, but these speculations were never confirmed. This seemingly fantastic strength, appearing out of nowhere, gave the defense another argument to insist on a state of affect. Under the cover of night, the woman moved her husband's body into the pit and buried it, though lightly covered would be more accurate. She then showered, removed the blood-stained curtains and bed linen, placing them in several trash bags, and dispersed them in different bins. The bloodied mattress was simply flipped over to the other side, as she didn't know what else to do with it. The remaining time until dawn was spent scrubbing blood from the floor, walls, and carpet. The carpet presented a problem, as a large stain proved impossible to remove. Resourcefully, the lady doused it in bleach, hoping the chemicals would destroy any traces of the violent confrontation that had occurred in that room. Assaulted and fled? That morning, Susan called her husband's parents, who lived in Austin, Texas. Sobbing, she informed them that her husband, under the influence of alcohol and controlled substances, had assaulted her and their young son, then wreaked havoc in the house, spilling a bottle of bleach on the carpet, before declaring that he was fed up and leaving her. Jeffrey's parents were shocked. They knew their son was far from perfect and genuinely felt sorry for their daughter-in-law. But upon hearing that he had hit the child, they immediately offered for Susan and the children to come and stay with them for a while. However, the young mother refused. She added that she would file a report with the police and disclose everything that had been happening in their home. 2 days later, Mrs. Wright went to the police station, as her husband's sudden disappearance was raising more and more questions, and something had to be done. She reported that she and her children were victims of domestic violence at the hands of her husband and needed protection. Susan managed to obtain a restraining order against her husband from approaching her and the children, although she already knew very well that her significant other would never be able to come near them again. As evidence, Susan showed bruises and cuts on her arms, which she claimed were inflicted by her husband with keys when she tried to fend him off. There was also a small bruise on Bradley's face, and the boy confirmed that his dad had hit him. At first glance, the story told by the tearful woman sounded quite plausible and logical. Her husband, under the influence of a mix of alcohol and controlled substances, attacked his wife and young son, and then, realizing what he had done, got scared and fled. But as time passed, Jeffrey made no contact, which became very suspicious. It appeared he had run away without his belongings, documents, and even his mobile phone was left at home. The man hadn't shown up for work or at his parents', and none of his friends or neighbors had seen him. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Such behavior is typical of criminals who decide to lay low, but he hadn't ended a life or inflicted serious injuries to warrant such a flight. The horrifying truth. Susan found it unbearable to stay in the house where she had confronted her husband and where his body was buried in the yard. She started to feel as if he were still alive and about to rise from his grave for revenge. She was practically losing her mind, and their dog Buck kept barking and trying to dig up the burial site. On January 17th, having taken her children, the perpetrator went to her mother's house. Her mother was aware of what had happened, but upon seeing her daughter, she realized the full extent of the truth. Velma simply asked, "You killed your husband, didn't you?" Her daughter burst into tears and nodded. She confessed what had happened and revealed where she had hidden the body, repeatedly saying she didn't know what to do next. On her mother's advice, the next day Susan contacted a lawyer named Neil Davis, to whom she confessed to ending her husband's life and trying to conceal her crime. The experienced defense attorney learned all the details, thought through the possible scenarios, and on January 19th called the office of the Harris County District Attorney. Davis reported that Mrs. Wright had ended her own husband's life and buried his body in the backyard, as she herself had confessed, and was ready to give a statement at the police station. On January 24th, 2003, Susan voluntarily went to the police, stating that she would make a full confession. Her story was disjointed. She got confused in the details and sometimes contradicted herself. She spoke of her late husband as if he were still alive, claimed she was afraid of him, and asked for protection. Consequently, she was subjected to a psychiatric evaluation, which revealed a nervous breakdown and depression, but overall, Wright was capable of understanding her actions. The gruesome discovery. When the remains of the deceased husband were extracted from the makeshift grave in the backyard, investigators were astounded, having never witnessed such brutality before. Experts counted 193 knife wounds on the victim's body, 8 in the groin area, about 30 on the legs, 23 on the shoulders and arms, 22 in the abdominal area, 46 on the chest, 23 on the neck, and 41 on the face. Only one head wound could have been the cause of death. All other cuts were superficial and individually posed no direct threat to life, suggesting that the man suffered a prolonged and agonizing death while conscious, as his wife repeatedly struck him with a small knife. Deep marks were found on Jeffrey's wrists and ankles from the ties and belt used by his wife to bind him. The nature of these injuries indicated that the victim had tried to free himself, but was unsuccessful. Notably, the ties and belt remained on the body. Traces of candle wax were also found on the deceased's chest and groin area. Mrs. Wright claimed it was accidental, as her husband had knocked over a lit candle onto himself, but the prosecution believed that the hot wax was more likely a form of torture inflicted on the bound victim, meant to cause suffering. In the mouth of the deceased, his wife's underwear was still present, acting as a gag that prevented him from screaming or calling for help. Toxicological reports revealed traces of alcohol and several controlled substances in the deceased's system. Under the influence of such a cocktail, the man could have indeed behaved aggressively and irrationally. The bedroom where the confrontation took place appeared normal at first glance, except for a large bleach stain on the carpet. Susan had spent considerable time cleaning up, which was evident. But once special chemical agents and equipment were used to reveal wiped-away blood traces, the scene presented itself in an entirely different light. Blood was found everywhere, even on the ceiling, and the mattress was thoroughly soaked in it. The start of the trial and the defense's version. The trial of the accused began at the end of February 2004. By that time, Mrs. Wright had been in custody for a year, and her children were being cared for by her parents and sister Cindy. Her lawyer was well prepared for the trial and had worked extensively with his client. Susan was almost continuously in tears as she recounted that horrific night and the events leading up to it. According to the woman, She had suffered years of abuse and cruel treatment from her husband, but when he started raising his hand to the children, she couldn't bear it. The defendant claimed that on that fateful evening, her husband returned from his training in an agitated state, began demonstrating boxing techniques to their 5-year-old son, and said that the boy would also take up boxing. When a frightened Bradley refused, his father hit him in the face. Susan then put the children to bed and decided to have a serious talk with her husband, urging him to seek help at a clinic. However, he became angry, grabbed his keys, and was about to leave. She tried to stop him, which led to a struggle during which he sustained injuries to her palms and wrists. Then, as the defendant claimed, her husband struck her, causing her to fall and momentarily lose her bearings. When she came to, she saw Jeffrey holding a knife. The woman's testimony became highly inconsistent thereafter, and she couldn't explain how the weapon ended up in her hands. Her lawyer attributed this to a state of affect, arguing that it was why his client, having seized the knife, began to strike and didn't stop until she had inflicted multiple wounds all over her husband's body. Regarding the ties and belt, Susan claimed she attached them to the victim's limbs after the confrontation to secure him to the cart and transport him to the yard. The wax, as previously mentioned, supposedly landed on his body accidentally from a candle on her bedside table that she lit in the evenings instead of a nightlight. However, she couldn't explain at all why her underwear was found in the deceased's mouth. The prosecution's version and verdict. The prosecution's version and arguments were far more convincing and logical. Experts proved that the deep wounds and abrasions on the wrists and ankles were inflicted while the man was still alive, suggesting that the binding was part of an intimate game used by the defendant to lure the victim into a trap. Consequently, the presence of a gag in the man's mouth was also reasonably explained. Furthermore, all injuries were inflicted at a certain angle, as if the perpetrator was above Jeffrey's body or sitting astride him, not in the midst of a struggle, which would have resulted in a different pattern of injuries. All the cuts were made from the front, as the victim was lying on his back and securely fixed. Whether Susan had premeditated her husband's demise and planned to use the pit he dug for the fountain as a grave was not definitively established. However, the prosecution leaned towards the theory that she had carefully planned everything, hoping to receive a substantial sum from insurance. The case received widespread publicity, with Susan being dubbed in the press as the Blue-Eyed Butcher or Blonde Meat Grinder. Jeffrey's relatives demanded the harshest punishment for her, while most neighbors pitied the woman, recalling occasional bruises on her body that resembled marks of physical abuse, which she attributed to her clumsiness. Initially, the prosecutors sought life imprisonment for Mrs. Wright, but later softened their demands to 45 years of incarceration. In March 2004, the defendant was found guilty and sentenced to 25 years in prison. She showed no reaction to the judge's words and appeared completely detached. A year later, Susan's lawyers attempted to file an appeal, but it was rejected. New developments and reduced sentence. In 2008, Wright and her defense team filed another appeal. This time, a new witness's testimony significantly influenced the course of the case. The witness was a woman named Misty McMichael, the wife of former NFL champion Steve McMichael. In the mid-1990s, she had a prolonged relationship with Jeffrey Wright, even being engaged to him for about a year. She shared her experiences of enduring physical abuse, humiliations, and cruel treatment from Wright, which led her to break off the engagement and permanently sever ties with him. Considering these new circumstances and the witness's testimony, Susan's prison sentence was reduced to 20 years. In 2014, at the age of 38, she became eligible for parole for the first time, but was ultimately denied. She received a second denial in July 2017. Finally, in the winter of 2020, after spending 16 years in prison, the Blonde Meat Grinder was released. She was 44 years old at the time of her release. Waiting for her outside the prison walls were reporters and photographers, at the sight of whom she burst into tears and pleaded to be left alone. It's worth noting that Mrs. Wright's trial received extensive media coverage and was even broadcast on the national American television network Court TV. This story later became the basis for an episode of the popular documentary TV show 48 Hours Mystery, as well as an episode of The Secret Lives of Stepford Wives titled Deadly Love, which aired in 2014. In 2012, the feature film Blue-Eyed Butcher was released, starring actress Sarah Paxton as Susan Wright. Additionally, in 2014, Canadian documentary filmmaker Chloe Belland released a 17-minute short film titled The Wheel of Fortune, inspired by the trial of the Jeffrey Wright case. A horrifying tale of a woman's revenge. It's said that a humiliated and insulted woman is capable of anything, with the most terrifying in this list being revenge, cruel, ingenious, and sometimes unpredictable. Much in this regard depends on the lady's level of sanity, but one must not overlook the depth of her hurt. This destructive emotion can be carefully hidden within a woman for years, but if it erupts, it will sweep away everything in its path. The story of the Bobbit spouses in the early 90s shook the world, and their surname became a byword, spawning the verb to bobbit, which means to cut or to chop. This case drew heightened public attention not just to the issues of domestic violence, but also to such a delicate subject as marital assault, which many try to sidestep. Let's delve into everything step by step. Who is Lorena Bobbit? Lorena Leonore Bobbit, born Gallo, was born on May 15, 1970, in the town of Bucay, located in eastern Guayas, Ecuador, near the province of Chimborazo. She was the youngest child in a simple and very modest family. When she was in elementary school, her family moved to Venezuela and settled in Caracas. Lorena grew up quite clever. She performed well in school, was diligent and goal-oriented. In her teenage years, she lost her father, and her relationship with her mother, Elvia Gallo, was quite strained. As soon as she graduated from school, she decided to move to the United States to live with her paternal cousin, Yana Basutti. Her relative gladly took her in and helped her with the paperwork for a student visa. However, she was a very conservative woman, so Lorena, living in her house, had to abide by a strict set of rules, just like Yana's own children, and also take on some of the household duties. Despite everything, the young woman decided to stay in the U.S. as she realized that it offered her far more opportunities than Latin America. She had long been attracted to the beauty industry, so Gallo decided to train as a manicurist. Moreover, Basutti owned her own beauty salon located in the city center, had extensive experience in the field, and was eager to help her niece learn the profession by allowing her to observe the work of the specialists and practice on her own. Later, her aunt arranged for her to work part-time in her salon. Meeting John Bobbit. About 8 months after she moved to the new country, the young woman had settled in, enrolled in college, and was working as a manicurist in her relative's salon while gradually saving money. In September 1988, Lorena was preparing to go to a party with several of her friends. Her aunt gave her strict instructions on how to behave and what time she needed to be home, and she promised that everything would be fine. The modest young beauty was nervous, as it was her first time preparing to go to a nightlife establishment so late at night. She chose a relatively modest outfit, unlike her friends, applied makeup, and styled her hair fashionably. Upon arriving at the nightclub, she was struck by the carefree and festive atmosphere inside. The venue was filled with young people dancing, having fun and socializing, and Lorena couldn't help but think that such a place might be where she could meet the man of her dreams. This thought proved to be prophetic. A few minutes later, she noticed a very attractive young man intently looking at her and smiling. He waved at her, and she waved back. Then the young man approached her and introduced himself. He was John Bobbit, and he could not take his eyes off the young beauty with the quite exotic appearance. The guy was handsome, tall, and charismatic. He cracked jokes and skillfully paid compliments, so she couldn't resist his charm. They spent the evening dancing and chatting, and afterwards, the new acquaintance walked Lorena to her aunt's home. As they said goodbye, he asked for her home phone number and promised to call soon. Who is John Bobbit? John Wayne Bobbit was born on March 24, 1967, in Buffalo, in the northwestern part of New York State. He was the youngest of 3 children in his family. At the age of 3, the boy lost his father, who tragically died, and his mother, unable to cope with the shock, ended up in a psychiatric clinic after a serious nervous breakdown. All 3 children were taken into the care of their religious aunt and uncle, who wanted to help their relatives in this difficult situation. The boy was still very young at the time, but the events that occurred undoubtedly left a mark on his life. The aunt and uncle raised the children with strictness, in accordance with religious canons. They all attended church every Sunday and engaged in charity work, trying to help those around them. John was not an outstanding student, but overall, he did fairly well in school. As a teenager, he decided to pursue a future in military service. After undergoing the necessary training and special preparation at a military academy, the young man joined the ranks of the Marines, where he proved himself as a brave, disciplined, and determined young man. However, after a few years, the strict regime and the need to obey in the army began to weigh on him. After leaving the service, with some military experience and skills, he was hired as a security guard at one of the city's popular establishments. But he later changed jobs frequently, not staying long at any. A whirlwind romance and a modest wedding. The day after they met, John, as promised, called Lorena to ask her out on a date. The young couple simply walked through the park, engaging in easy conversation about various topics, and John made it clear that he wanted to continue their relationship. Lorena was not opposed to this, but according to the rules set by her aunt, she had to introduce her boyfriend to her before they could start a serious relationship. John accepted all the conditions, and on the appointed day, he came to dinner at the home of his beloved's relative. Bobbit was very sweet, courteous, and considerate, yet he made an effort to appear serious. He managed to make a good impression on the strict Yana, and after a serious one-on-one conversation with the young man, the woman allowed her niece to continue seeing John. 6 months after the start of their romantic relationship, the suitor proposed to Lorena, and she accepted. She was overjoyed, having always dreamed of a family, children, and a home of her own. The couple began preparing for the most important event of their lives, and in June 1989, shortly after Gallo turned 19, they made their union official. The wedding celebration was quite modest, as the young couple did not have the money for a lavish ceremony, and they chose to spend their savings on a honeymoon by the warm ocean coast. They were happy, but the only shadow over the celebration was the absence of the bride and groom's parents. Instead, their aunts and uncles came to share the joyous moment with them. And so the fairy tale ends. After the wedding and a delightful honeymoon, the couple moved to Virginia and settled in a quiet and cozy area of the city called Manassas. The first few months of their life together were like a real fairy tale. They enjoyed each other's company, showing mutual tenderness, care, and love. But as the new year of 1990 approached, the situation began to change for the worse. At first, Lorena tried not to pay much attention to some of her young husband's sharp remarks and rudeness, thinking it was just a so-called adjustment period. But one day, when she served cooled soup for dinner, her husband simply threw the plate on the floor and then started yelling at his wife, insulting her and calling her a terrible homemaker. She tried to argue, pointing out that John was to blame since she had called him to the table several times, but he was too engrossed in the TV. In response, he slapped her, and she retaliated in kind. Lorena had always believed that she could stand up for herself and would not let herself be mistreated. But the longer she lived with this man, the more he dominated her, suppressing her will, feelings, and determination to stand up to him. John established his own rules in their home, and he treated his wife as nothing more than an object, constantly criticizing her, physically abusing her, and coercing intimacy, even when she was unwilling. Failed motherhood. The young wife naively believed that if they had a child together, her husband would soften and stop his cruel behavior. However, as it turned out, John had no desire to have children. Therefore, when Lorena informed him of her pregnancy in 1992, he became incredibly angry. He demanded that she get an abortion immediately, and they never revisited the subject. Lorena procrastinated for several weeks, hoping her husband would change his mind, but he remained adamant and continued to pressure her to comply. Eventually, he literally forced her to go to the hospital and terminate the pregnancy, which was a tremendous shock to her and took a long time to recover from. In reality, John simply wanted to live for pleasure, unburdened by anything. He did not have a steady job, making ends meet by working as a bouncer in entertainment venues, and if he needed money, he would unashamedly take it from his wife, who worked as a manicurist and highly sought-after makeup artist in a beauty salon. The last straw. Lorena tried not to tell anyone about what was happening at home and not to complain, but her friends and colleagues began to notice changes in her behavior. From a joyful, smiling girl, she turned into a quiet, haunted shadow of her former self. Those around her suspected that all was not well in her family, but they had no idea how serious it was. Her husband's behavior became increasingly controlling. He closely monitored where she went and who she spoke to. At home, she had to follow the rules he set, and intimacy between them occurred only when John wanted it, regardless of Lorena's wishes. The poor girl couldn't share her problems with anyone, as she found the situation shameful and humiliating. On June 22, 1993, John, along with his longtime military buddy, decided to go out to an entertainment venue. The men partied and drank until late at night, while Lorena was at home alone. She did not wait up for her husband and went to the bedroom around midnight, soon falling asleep. Around 3 a.m, a drunk and aroused John returned home. He didn't waste any time and ripped the shirt off his sleeping wife. Lorena hardly understood what was happening when her husband forcefully took advantage of her. She begged him to stop and not to do this, crying, but he was completely indifferent to her pleas and tears. After it was over, John simply collapsed next to her and fell asleep. Lorena, trembling and sobbing, made her way to the kitchen. She poured herself some water and took a few sips to calm down, but then her gaze fell on a stand with large, sharp kitchen knives. Her hand reached out on its own and pulled out a carving knife. Out of her mind, she went back to the bedroom where her husband lay on his back, snoring drunkenly. She grabbed his genitalia with her left hand, squeezed hard, and sharply cut through with the knife, severing a large part of it. John jumped up, screaming in agony, while Lorena simply walked out of the room, went to the garage, and got into her car, speeding away through the deserted nighttime streets of the city. She only came to her senses at an intersection when she saw a red light at the traffic signal. At that moment, she looked at her blood-stained hands and realized that she was still holding the severed part of John's body in her left hand. She rolled down the window and threw the detested piece of flesh out, then continued driving. Lorena headed to the home of a close friend, who was stunned by her nighttime visit and the state she was in. After Lorena told her what had happened, her friend, realizing the gravity of the situation, called the police herself and summoned a medical team to the house where the injured Bobbit was. Precision surgery. Throughout this ordeal, John was desperately trying to stop the bleeding by pressing a sheet against his wound. Notably, the groin vein is a major vessel, and its injury nearly always results in death from blood loss. However, John was somewhat fortunate, if one could say that, because a clot had formed, slowing the blood loss significantly. The responding medics arrived in time to transport him to the nearest hospital, where he received immediate medical attention. The question then arose about the whereabouts of the severed part of his genitalia, as it was still possible to reattach it, reattaching it to its original place with restoration of its initial physiological functions. Lorena indicated the approximate area of the road where she had discarded her husband's anatomical fragment, and after an extensive search, the police were able to find it. The amputated organ was cleansed with antiseptic, then placed in a special container with medical ice, and urgently transported to the hospital where the injured party was already being treated. The surgeon who arrived from the state capital was astounded by the complexity of the situation, as he had never encountered such a case before, but he proceeded with the operation anyway. He performed a unique surgery for that time, which lasted more than 9 hours and was more than successful. Despite the traumatic amputation of the organ and the fact that it had lain on the road for over an hour, all tissues and vessels were successfully reattached, and the patient quickly began to recover. Public outcry. That same night, Lorena was arrested and taken to the police station for questioning, as well as to clarify all the circumstances and motives of her actions. She immediately confessed to everything and shared her harrowing story that had driven her to such a desperate act. She recounted how 4 years of marriage had turned into a real nightmare for her, with her husband regularly abusing her both emotionally and physically, and forcing intimacy only when he desired. Mrs. Bobbit also mentioned how, about a year ago, her husband had forced her to terminate a pregnancy, despite her deep desire to have a child, and that abortion had been a traumatizing event for her. Regarding the incident itself, she said she remembered very little of that night and had acted as if she were in a fog. Lorena recounted how her husband had come home drunk and simply taken advantage of her, and although she tried to resist, he ignored her. After the incident, she went to the kitchen for water, and the next thing she remembered was her husband's scream, the roar of the car engine, and the part of his genitalia that she was clutching in her hand as she sat behind the wheel. The case caused a significant stir in the press and was actively covered by the media. Many women like Lorena, who had suffered from domestic violence, as well as feminist organizations, which were gaining strength and popularity at the time, rallied to her side. In the early 90s, wives who were subjected to emotional and physical abuse by their husbands typically remained silent about their plight. Society was still inclined to blame the victims themselves, suggesting that they provoked conflicts or behaved improperly. It was assumed that a wife should be submissive and obey her husband in everything, and if the husband was dissatisfied and resorted to violence, it was her fault. Intimacy in marriage was considered a duty of the wife, not open to discussion. On the other hand, almost all men sided with John. Many feared that Lorena's act might prove contagious, prompting other women suffering from physical and intimate violence in marriage to also take up knives. According to official statistics, there were several million such women in the country at that time. Trials and sentences of the spouses. 2 parallel court cases began almost simultaneously. Lorena officially charged her husband only with taking advantage of her on that fateful night, although in court she detailed the years of regular abuse and beatings, emotional violence, and humiliations she endured, as well as the abortion she was forced to undergo against her will under her husband's coercion. John's testimony was confused. He denied all allegations against him, but much of what Lorena said was corroborated by facts. For instance, it was confirmed that he did not have steady employment or a stable source of income, yet he loved spending time in entertainment venues, often forcibly or deceitfully taking money from his wife to do so. Additionally, Lorena's friends confirmed that they had repeatedly seen bruises and scrapes on her body, and she had been in a depressed state for a long time, though she tried not to complain. The court concluded that the husband had indeed abused his wife both emotionally and physically throughout their marriage, driving her to desperation. However, regarding the charge of intimate violence that occurred on the night of June 23, 1993, there was not enough evidence, and thus John was acquitted. He presented several versions of what happened that evening, and the jury, composed of 9 women and 3 men, found him not guilty in the fall of that year. Lorena's trial began in September 1993. She was charged with inflicting severe bodily harm on her spouse. Her lawyers argued that she acted while suffering from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, caused by the ongoing emotional and physical abuse from her husband. A psychiatric evaluation was ordered, which confirmed that she acted in a state of distress, unaware of her actions, and therefore could not be held responsible for what she had done. In early January of the following year, after nearly 8 hours of deliberation, the jury decided that Lorena could not be held criminally responsible for her actions, as she was in a state of insanity at the time of the offense. However, she was required to undergo a 6-week treatment program at a specialized clinic, after which she was able to return to her previous life. The spouses officially divorced only in 1995, after which Lorena reverted to her maiden name. What became of John later? John remained indignant for a long time that his wife faced no punishment for her actions. He decided to fully capitalize on his sudden notoriety, aiming to extract as much money as possible from such scandalous fame. John founded his own music band called Severed Parts, but the group was short-lived as it failed to garner any public interest. When offered a substantial fee to star in adult films in the late 90s, he did not hesitate to accept. Thus, he appeared in explicit films titled Frankenpenis, a play on Frankenstein, and John Wayne Bobbit, Uncut. John acted in several more films of a similar genre, but interest in him and his reattached organ quickly waned. For a long time, John was eager to appear on various talk shows and gave interviews extensively, but over the years, such offers became less frequent, and the story gradually faded from memory. John then found work as a bartender in an entertainment venue in Las Vegas, and by his 50s, he was struggling to make ends meet by taking jobs as a mover, driver, and pizza delivery man. In 1999, he received a suspended sentence for theft. Regarding his personal life, during the high-profile court case that the entire country followed, journalists discovered that Bobbit had an illegitimate son named Andrew, born in 1992 to one of his lovers, Beatrice Williams. In 1994, John was brought to trial for assaulting his new girlfriend, Christina Elliott, who worked as a dancer in a nightclub. He spent 15 days in jail for this and received probation. In the early 2000s, John was arrested 3 times for assaulting his then wife, Joanna Farrell. This time, he was imprisoned for a year for violating his probation. They officially divorced in 2004. What happened to Lorena? Unlike her former husband, Lorena did not take pride in her scandalous notoriety and tried to stay out of the limelight. In 1996, she decided to return to her native Ecuador, where her mother, Elvia, was living at the time. However, just 6 months later, Lorena made the news again when her mother accused her of assault. The conflict was resolved without going to court, and the women continued to live together. A year later, Lorena returned to the USA, where she opened her own small beauty salon in Washington. In 2007, she founded a foundation called Lorena's Red Wagon, which focused on helping women who had suffered from domestic violence. Soon after, Lorena agreed to give an interview for the first time in a long time and appeared on CBS News' The Morning Show, where she discussed her life post-incident. She also appeared on the popular Oprah Winfrey talk show. In the mid-2000s, Lorena remarried. Her new husband was a man named Dave Bellinger, with whom she had a daughter in 2006. She preferred not to recall her marriage to Bobbit at all, and claimed she did not follow his life after their divorce. A meeting 15 years later. In 2009, nearly 15 years after their sensational legal battles had ended, the former spouses met face-to-face for the first time on the show Insider. John apologized to Lorena for the way he had treated her during their marriage and declared that he still loved her despite everything. Lorena was visibly moved by his words and confirmed that every year on Valentine's Day, her ex-husband still sends her flowers and cards. A broken vase can never be mended, goes the famous saying, symbolizing irreversible harm or betrayal. A fragile vessel may be pieced back together, yet its cracks linger, forever altering its appearance and utility. This analogy hits close to home for survivors of intimate exploitation. Historically, our society has often tried to diminish the pain of such experiences, to avoid causing discomfort to others. However, our culture and legal systems have evolved. Individuals who have suffered these indignities are now sharing their stories and receiving the support they need, propelled by dire incidents that could not be ignored. Among these is the tragic story of Antonia Barra from Chile, around which the entire national community rallied to ensure justice was served against her aggressor. The loss of the young woman became known on the evening of October 13, 2019. Her family could never have envisioned how that day would conclude. Her sister Carla, visiting their parents' home, went upstairs to say hello to Antonia, expecting a casual chat. However, finding her seemingly asleep, Carla chose not to disturb her and headed to the door. Before she could leave, she heard Antonia ask about their mother and request the light be turned off. After telling Carla she loved her, Antonia turned away. Maybe she's just tired or not in the mood, thought Carla. Little did she know, Antonia was grappling with harrowing thoughts that left her feeling there was only one way out from her profound distress. By 7 that evening, their mother, not hearing any response from Antonia's room, entered to find a harrowing scene. Her daughter was motionless, suspended above the floor. Marcella rushed to her, finding no signs of life. Overwhelmed by shock, she sought assistance from neighbors. The family friends helped take down the body and called for emergency services. Shortly afterward, Alejandro Barra addressed the media, vowing to uncover the root causes of his daughter's desperate act and to seek justice. Known for her vivacity and intelligence, it was clear that something significant had profoundly impacted Antonia. The autopsy confirmed self-strangulation as the cause of death. The case required immediate action. Not waiting for official inquiries, the parents initiated their own investigation. Private detectives meticulously pieced together the last days of Antonia's life, identifying the individual who had driven her to despair. Promptly, Alejandro and Marcella reported Martin Pradenas to the police, suspecting him of exploitation. There was little known about him. He was born and lived in Temuco, Chile, the same city as Antonia. He came from a large family, parents, a sister, and a brother. The dynamics within his family are unclear, as there is scant information available online, which is justified later. Undoubtedly, in his early youth, a young woman named Daniela Alvarez bore his child. Nonetheless, the relationship between the two did not last long. After the birth, the couple parted ways. Detectives discovered that between 2015 and 2017, Antonia and Martin communicated via a social network. At that time, Antonia was a teenager. They exchanged messages and commented on each other's photos, though their interactions were confined to the digital realm. However, they eventually met in person, which unfortunately led to a tragic outcome. Antonia was born in the late 1980s into a strong and close-knit family. The Barra family home was large and spacious, suited to a family of their size. Loving parents Alejandro and Marcella raised 5 children, 4 daughters and 1 son. It was a household where care and attention were plentiful. The children were kind and well-behaved, causing no significant trouble. However, Antonia stood out among her siblings. She was unusually perceptive, responsible, and ambitious from a young age, which made her a particular source of pride for her parents. She excelled in school, got along well with her teachers, and had plans for her future. Antonia dreamed of traveling and leading a fulfilling life. After graduating high school, she got into her university of choice and began studying a highly sought-after major. As a freshman, she immersed herself in mastering the basics of her future profession and actively participated in academic and social activities, making new friends. Her friends shared her interests and aspirations. Antonia formed an especially close bond with Consuela Uribe, who was studying at the law school. The friends would often go out, shop, and attend parties together. They became very close. Thus, when Antonia broke up with her boyfriend Rodrigo, Consuela suggested she distract herself from the heartbreak. Antonia was struggling with the breakup, so she embraced her friend's idea. She wanted to clear her mind and temporarily forget the past. The friends planned a trip for Chile's Independence Day on September 18th. Their destination was the tourist town of Pucón. By sheer coincidence, it was there that Martin and Antonia's paths crossed again. Martin was planning to attend an electronic music festival. The event was to be held at a local club called Black Room, where a DJ friend of his was performing. On September 17th, around 6:30 p.m., Uribe and Barra set off for Pucón with 3 other friends, one of whom was Consuela's boyfriend. The journey went smoothly, and upon arrival, the young people stayed in different accommodations. The girls stayed in a summer house owned by the Wright family. After 8 p.m., the friends began preparing for a party at the popular venue, Black Room. The night promised a sea of unforgettable emotions. Before leaving, Antonia exchanged messages with her father, who asked her to be careful and cautious around strangers. In response, she reassured her father, writing that prudence was her foremost trait. Law enforcement officials repeatedly interviewed Martin Cardenas, but he denied any wrongdoing regarding Antonia. He claimed their intimacy was consensual and vehemently denied any involvement in her tragic end. However, detectives had their own perspective and evidence regarding the matter. During the investigation, it was established that Martin left Temuco on September 17 around noon, accompanied by friends. They planned to return the next day. Upon reaching their destination, the group held a party at a rented house, filled with conversation, jokes, and of course, alcohol. Meanwhile, Antonia and Consuela got ready and headed to the club. There, they ordered a table, food, and drinks. The friends enjoyed themselves, chatting and dancing extensively. Needless to say, the Black Room Club became the venue for the young people's unexpected reunion. The chance meeting delighted them, and the man and woman spent the evening together, chatting and dancing. It was clear they were fond of each other. Antonia occasionally left him to return to her friend, who was also enjoying herself, and to greet the male acquaintances with whom she had traveled. Moving from one bar to another, she didn't realize how carried away she got with the alcohol, likely due to the long drive and an empty stomach, something she usually did not allow herself to do. Around 6:45 a.m., Consuela found her friend pleasantly chatting with a mutual acquaintance, Emilio. At that point, she told Antonia it was time to leave. Antonia refused, feeling good and wanting to continue the evening. Her friend advised her to stop drinking and reconsider her decision, but Antonia was adamant and chose to stay at the club while Consuela left. This turned out to be a regrettable decision for Antonia. Emilio became an unwitting witness to the events that unfolded afterwards, which he detailed during the investigation and in court. He noted that Martin approached Antonia and started a conversation with her. He then took her by the hand and led her towards the exit. Emilio remarked that Antonia acted oddly, unsure whether she was engaging in the conversation or just confused due to the alcohol. Nevertheless, it seemed she did not mind being led away, or perhaps she was unaware of it. Emilio assumed that the man had invited her to join him, and she agreed. Nonetheless, external surveillance footage told a different story. Martin's friends recounted that they left the club in 2 cars, but there was no room for the pair in either vehicle. Therefore, they proceeded on foot. Along the way, they came across a store. Surveillance footage made it clear that the man coerced the woman into entering. She could barely stand and was unable to resist. Martin, slightly more sober, was able to somewhat control the situation. Throughout the night, they were captured on camera several times. Along the way, Cardenas was overly affectionate and tried to kiss his companion, who did not reciprocate and tried to pull away. Upon entering the rented house, none of his friends paid much attention to the woman. Only 19-year-old Barbara, who had joined recently and hadn't been drinking, noticed that the couple was intoxicated. Afterward, they went upstairs. Around 9 a.m., Consuela received a voice message from her friend. Initially, she couldn't make out what was being said. After listening more carefully, she understood a few words. Antonia was pleading to be picked up. Since her friend didn't know her exact location, she used GPS to find it. Consuela, accompanied by her boyfriend Jose, went to the designated location. Upon entering the house, they were met by a naked Martin who was covering himself with a pillow. When Consuela asked him where her friend was, he claimed he didn't know. They found Barra in one of the upstairs rooms, lying on a bed in her underwear, quietly crying. Jose picked her up and carried her to the car. Consuela asked what had happened, but Antonia could only cry. The young couple tried to console her, hugging and attempting to engage her in conversation. Back at the summer house, Antonia confessed everything. Martin had exploited her against her will, and she felt powerless to stop it. Her memories were hazy. She couldn't recall much, but one thing was clear. He had wronged her. This occurred when they went upstairs. Afterwards, he left her alone and disappeared. Upon hearing about the incident, Jose and Consuela insisted that Antonia report the scoundrel to the police and seek justice. However, she refused, fearing that her parents and the public would find out. She chose to quietly endure the trauma and try to recover on her own. She asked them to tell no one about the incident. During this heartfelt conversation, Antonia received a message from her father asking how she was doing and joking about whether she had been drinking too much. To avoid arousing suspicion, she tried to respond in her usual manner, thereby inadvertently highlighting her own intentions. The next day, Antonia met with Martin to talk. However, he was dismissive and arrogant. He insisted that the events of the previous night had been consensual. At that point, Antonia realized that she would not hear the truth or receive an apology. She knew she had to try to move on. Later, psychotherapists invited to the court hearing will explain that at the time, Antonia was experiencing intimacy trauma syndrome. It's characterized by disruptions in physical, emotional, cognitive, and interpersonal behavior. This condition can appear immediately following the incident or even months, and sometimes years later. The poor girl was suffering through an acute stage alone. She could not rid herself of distressing sensations, distraction, anxiety, confusion, alternating with hysterics and crying. She undoubtedly felt a compulsive desire to cleanse herself, experiencing bouts of nausea or even vomiting. For 3 weeks, Barra kept silent and tried to behave as usual. A childhood friend confessed that she noticed nothing unusual about her. However, her classmates could not overlook the memory impairments and disorganization associated with the syndrome. One of them remarked on her declining academic performance, which was very uncharacteristic of the once disciplined student. When asked what was the cause, Antonia cited poor health. It should be noted that a large number of witnesses came to the girl's defense during the trial: friends, acquaintances, and classmates. But what was the turning point in making a fateful decision? Perhaps Antonia would have remained alive, sought professional help over time, had it not been for a series of events. Somehow, her terrible secret became known to an ex-boyfriend. However, the information reached him in a very unflattering form, which he hurried to report. The girl replied that she was not at fault for what had happened. The information he had was a gross exaggeration. Then Rodrigo did not believe her. Moreover, the day before the incident, Martin called. It is unclear what the conversation between them entailed, possibly threats from his side. One thing is clear: the next day the girl was gone. A few hours before her death, she sent a farewell message to her boyfriend, and in a family chat, she shared a childhood video. In it, Antonia was dancing and laughing joyfully, showing how much she missed her former self. She could not return to her previous way of life, thoughts, and actions. This tragedy made a deep impression. Thanks to Alejandro finding the strength to share his daughter's story nationwide, her tragedy resonated with the public. Antonia's name was written on posters, in social media hashtags, even on building walls. Public support had an incredible result. In less than a week, women came forward with similar claims against Pradenas. 6 new charges were filed against his name, reporting actions he took from 2010 to 2019. The man turned out to be a criminal and was taken into custody. Concurrently, Martin's family petitioned to protect their personal information, which had leaked online. The family asserted that their constitutional right to honor and respect for private life was violated, citing numerous insults, aggressive messages, and fake information online. In these actions, the Pradenas family suspected, including the Barra family. On June 12, 2020, the Temuco court granted their request. The judge required Antonia's relatives to refrain from disclosing information about the assailant's family through social media and from making compromising publications. This decision sparked outrage. Chileans were extremely upset, believing that it protected Martin. On July 21st, the Barra family filed an appeal with the Supreme Court, but it was rejected. Later that month, the suspect's lawyer submitted a petition for protective measures concerning his client. In the same month, he was officially charged with several attacks. Public outcry was gaining momentum. In Chile, the investigation became known as the Antonia case, a symbol of justice restoration for victims of violence. Many women, after many years, dared to come forward about their experiences. On July 22nd, an unexpected event occurred. The court changed the previously decided preventive measure from detention to house arrest. Martin Pradenas was effectively set free. At the same time, the judge explained that this in no way summarizes the presumed punishment. Meanwhile, the prosecutor charged Martin with 5 instances of misconduct, but the court only acknowledged 2. Massive protests swept across the country. Thousands of people took to the streets, outraged by the cessation of investigations regarding certain facts and the decision on house arrest. The authorities supported the citizens by sending a request to the appeals court. The judiciary responded immediately. It revoked the selected preventive measure and took Martin into custody. The same court later eliminated the statute of limitations for 2 cases of intimate violence. Concurrently, Alejandro, along with feminist organizations, worked on drafting a bill that would establish punishments for such crimes. He emphasized that no one should remain indifferent when a woman is led away by a man without resisting, especially while intoxicated. Barra stressed the importance of taking necessary measures in such cases, as this state makes a woman a potential victim. The investigation continued. In February 2021, Martin's phone was found. Forensic analysis revealed it contained photos in which the accused displayed women's underwear. He was clearly proud of his conquests and apparently kept a count. The police report ran nearly 400 pages, including statements from victims and witnesses, people close to both Martin and Antonia, and those who had known them since childhood. The accused's childhood teacher recounted that Pradenas was a smart and cheerful child, but was very interested in topics related to intimacy. Some women recalled that when they were little, he touched them. At the time, however, no one thought much of it, as they were all children. On June 14, 2022, the criminal court in Temuco commenced its hearings, which were expected to last over a month. During this period, the prosecution presented a series of evidence, expert testimonies, and witness statements. The disclosed video footage clearly showed that Antonia was unable to control the situation. On August 26th, Martin was sentenced to 20 years of imprisonment for crimes against intimacy and acts of intimacy-related aggression. On December 29th, the Supreme Court accepted the defense's appeal, disagreeing with the verdict. A new trial was scheduled for spring 2023. Meanwhile, the efforts of the Barra family have an effect. The drafting of Antonia's law began, enhancing existing legislation to ensure that anyone committing an act of violence that pushed the victim to end their own life would be inevitably punished with imprisonment. On March 16th, the defendant's legal team resigned, and his case was taken over by public defense. Finally, on April 24, 2024, the second trial commenced for 5 cases of violence and 2 cases of forcible intimacy. During this time, Pradenas waived his right to remain silent and explained the events. He claimed that his crimes were committed under severe alcohol intoxication, to which the prosecutor responded that by drinking with the women, he made the victims vulnerable. On July 7, 2023, the man was found guilty. The federal prosecution demanded a sentence of 41 years in prison. On July 28, 2023, 31-year-old Martín Pradenas was sentenced to 17 years in prison for 7 intimacy-related offenses committed against 6 victims. Considering the time already spent in custody, he would serve 14 years. The tragedy that befell Antonia Barra helped expose a dangerous offender. It's unknown how many more innocent women might have suffered from his actions. The line between harassment and flirtation is very thin. One can never be prepared for someone deciding to cross that perilous line. However, the societal changes that have occurred have altered the perception of victims of violence. Now everyone understands the risks of uncontrolled desires and the inability to control oneself. Ultimately, the body and soul of another person are as fragile as a crystal vase, thus precious and inviolable.